Um, this came from my retreat back in January, really. And I shared a little bit about withdrawing with Jesus in one of my last sermons a few weeks ago, but I didn't tell you what happened. I just said God did something. So this is my chance to just share with you what God's been doing with me and with others as I've shared it with others over the last few weeks. And we're going to be looking at a particular model of spiritual growth that's based on this book called The Critical Journey, which is by Janet Hagberg, who's still alive, and Robert Gulick, who I think isn't. They first put this together in 1995. This edition was revised to 2007. So this is about 30 years old, this stuff, but it has come from a lot of research that they did about how people move on in their faith journeys. And, there are different models out there. This isn't the only one. There's a whole load of different models in different stages of faith, and, they all share some common things and have different things as well. But this is a model which I found really helpful, and which I've certainly related to, and I pray that you will be able to relate to it too. And just to say, if you don't, that's okay. If you go away thinking, what on earth was Dave on about? Just move on, don't worry about it. Drop what's not helpful and hold on to what is good with that. There are times, some of you, as I talk about this, will say, that's me. And others times, some of you will say, I have no idea what that's on about. Partly maybe because actually you haven't reached that point in your life yet. I'd say a lot of this stuff I can talk about, I've only really reached in the last 5 or 6 years, probably. But we're also going to be, as we do this, journeying through the life of Peter in the Bible as well. And we're going to go pretty quick fire. So I want you to have a Bible ready. We're going to flick to a whole load of different bits at each stage on the journey. I've shown this slide before, discipleship. What does discipleship look like? So often we can think it looks like a left. Well, it's a nice linear straight line, and of course we know that it isn't. And it looks a bit more like the line on the wiggly line on the right. We go forward, backwards, and it's not linear, and we go round and round in circles sometimes. But I want to give you a new diagram tonight. And I want to say I think it might be a bit more like that. I've added a bit of this to it. The red line I've added just this afternoon, and I've just been sitting there thinking I've got the red line wrong. Just imagine the red line as a cone that goes right to the end of the black thing. And that cone represents God. So actually, as we journey up the spiral, actually we journey as close to God at every stage, but actually as we journey up the spiral, God gets bigger. Our image of God gets bigger. And we understand there's more to it than we did understand before. These guys say there are 6 stages. One, it starts with recognizing God. Just to say as well, I have a handout for you on this, which I will give out after I've talked before we reflect. So you don't need to take notes on it, but I didn't want to give you the handout and let you look ahead. I wanted you to stay with me. So the key bits, the key slides are on there, but if you want to make further notes, do. But the handout's coming. So first stage is recognizing God. Second stage they call the life of discipleship. Third stage they call the productive life. And I would guess most people in this room will recognize and get those first 3 stages. Then it goes on to what they call the inward journey. And at some point between the inward journey and stage 5, there's something called the wall. And you hit the wall where things don't work anymore. And then actually, if you journey through the wall, you start on the outward journey, as it calls it. And then the 6th stage is the life of love, which probably most people in this room haven't got to, and I haven't got to yet. And maybe never will. Only a few get there. There's real saints get there, they say. And I want to just say there is the stream of God, just right in the middle of a stick of rock going through it all, but imagine that's a cone. The further up you get, the bigger God is. And a few things about this model, it talks about, it's not just that we get to that point and then we never go back. What we can do is we can move forwards and backwards between stages regularly. We might have got to stage 3 and then actually we find ourselves back in stage 2 again. Or we might have got ourselves to stage 5 and then find ourselves back against the wall. We can experience, it talks about more than one stage at a time. Maybe one area of our life is in one particular place and another area is in another particular place. And the third one's interesting. Stages are sequential and cumulative rather than better than another. So don't just think, actually, stage 5 is better than stage 3. They're all different stages that we'll journey through at different times. And we don't rush those stages. We dwell in those stages for as long as God takes us. But it does talk about us having a home stage, a stage where actually we operate most of the time in this moment. And I'm going through these different stages, I want to encourage you to think, which stage most resonates with where I am at the moment? That would be your home stage, but you might be still flitting between the others. And sometimes, we're actually not a particular home stage, we're in a transition, and actually they can be the hard times of going between one stage and another. They're particularly the stages of growth. They can be healthy stuff, but you can be a bit lost and think, I'm not quite sure where I am in those stages. But it can be healthy growth, but also you can get stuck in a particular stage and just get stuck and not move on. And maybe get stuck for years and years and years. And I think this model, part of what it does is it helps us find ways of getting unstuck. And I think as we'll see, my reflections on this is I think church does stages 1 to 3 really well. I think services and life groups do stages 1 to 3, what we need for that. But actually church is pretty rubbish at doing stages 4 to 6. And I think there's a challenge there for us, those of us in leadership, those of us discipling others as well, is to how do we help people move on in the higher stages? Because actually a lot of what we do in our services and in our life groups actually doesn't help people move on in stages 4, 5, and 6. So that's a bit of an overview of where we're going. So I'm going to take you through each stage at a time, but let's first of all start a bit in the story of Peter. I want you to turn to Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. The miraculous catch of fish. This, if you like, is the start of Peter's journey of discipleship. I'm going to read it quickly and reflect on a few things. One day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding round him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boats. When he'd finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they'd done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." I'm going to stop there. What we see in this picture is Peter has a bit of a need. He hasn't caught any fish. And Jesus is there and actually miraculously helps him to meet that need. He has there and then an encounter with Jesus. He doesn't know who Jesus is, but actually Jesus does this amazing miracle of this amazing catch of fish, and Peter saying, "Wow, who is this person?" He's in awe and wonder of him. But look at his reaction in verse 8. What does he say? He says, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." What we see there is a hint that this encounter has made Peter see that he's sinful. It doesn't take him any further. He doesn't know anything about forgiveness at this stage. But actually it's made him look at himself and say, "Whoa, I'm a sinful man. And this person is a holy person." There's an encounter there which has done something significant. If you like, he recognizes his guilt and his brokenness. And this is what stage 1 is all about, the recognition of God, as it's called. And what is faith at this stage? Well, it's simply recognizing God. You might not even be able to name it at that point, that is God, but recognizing something. And some recognition here, and I think this is particularly, directed at people who meet God later on in life, not people who are necessarily, I don't relate to this very much because I was brought up in a Christian home, so it's less easy to relate to, but people who meet God, who have a special encounter, maybe through Alpha, I look at some of you here, you know, you'd relate to this because you perhaps came with a need in yourself and you met this thing called God that you didn't know about. And maybe even God did something miraculous and, you know, changed you. And what we can find at this stage is that, you know, actually, generally at this stage, you know, we're wrapped up in our own story. Me is the center of our world. We can be vulnerable, insecure, hurting, broken, but God does something and meets us. And actually, the goal of this stage is then to find someone who can help us discover not just that we're broken, I'm guilty, go away from me, I'm a sinner, but who can help us to find that healing through God. And the church role in this stage actually is more than anything, it's just say, to find a community, to offer that person a community to be in, to journey with, who will introduce them to Jesus. Does that make sense? And I think just thinking about our young people who might be in Christian families, you know, what does the church more than anything offer our children? It offers them a community to be in, doesn't it? To say, we're going to introduce you to Jesus. Come and be part of us in our community there. So there's the first stage. Secondly, let's move on to Luke 11, 1-4. You know, what happens next? Well, Jesus invites Peter with the other 11 into community. But he doesn't just say, let's just go and hang out together. He teaches them. He disciples them. Luke 11, 1-4, you know, just as an example of this, I could have picked the Sermon on the Plain. I could have picked all sorts of Jesus teaching. But here, 11, 1-4, one day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples. And Jesus said to them, when you pray, say, Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us, and lead us not into temptation. You know, Jesus was actually teaching them what it means to believe and to be a follower of him. He was teaching them how to be a Christian. But also I think there's a key word there, which is actually forgiveness. Because I think at stage 2, the life of a discipleship, you know, which actually talks about faith being not just recognizing God, but learning about God. What we do at this stage is we experience forgiveness. We realize that we're not just guilty people, but actually that God has forgiven us. And that starts us off on our journey. And this stage is all about following a discipleship program, you know, getting into a small group, getting onto Alpha, you know, working out what it means to be a Christian, what we actually believe, what it means to do that in practice, growing in our understanding of faith, moving from just belonging to believing as well as belonging. So we believe in things and we learn what it means to live like that. It's a time of significant growth. And so what the church's role in stage 2 of discipleship is, it's about providing a community which disciples and teaches and models faith, just as Jesus did when he said to those 12 disciples, come and live life with me. You know, he showed them what living life with God was like. And so we need, you know, the church needs to provide, you know, models, role models, as well as teachers to help people journey through that stage to the next stage. Then we go on, flip to Luke 9, 1-6, and, you know, we won't go on to Luke 10, 1-17, but that looks like it as well. Here's just an example of the next stage. What we see is Jesus sending out the 12 and then the 72. Jesus sends out the 12. Let me read it, Luke 9. 1-6, page 1038. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal those who were ill. He told them, take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirts. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave the town. If people don't welcome you, leave the town, shake the dust of your feet as your testimony against them. So they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. Luke 10, verse 17, when he sends out the 72, has that lovely phrase, they returned with joy. Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. What's Jesus doing there? After stage 2, what's stage 3 all about? Releasing people to go and do the stuff, isn't it? And that's what stage 3 is. It's, they call the stage 3 the productive life, where faith actually is working for God. I want to note that word for, because it grates on me now. Working for God. And when I share some of my story later on, you'll see why. But working for rather than with. And the goal, what happens here, in stage 3, what we need to do then is to say, actually we move on then when we're released to identify our gifts and to use our gifts to serve others and to join in with God's mission. We're not just going to sit in a classroom learning the stuff all our days, but actually Jesus then invited his disciples, say, like, you've watched me do things, now you come and do them with me. And then here he says, now you go and do them and come back and tell me what it was like. Jesus released them into ministry, and that transformed their faith and gave them a big jump, big spurt in their faith and their growth, because they said, wow, look at what we can do with God's power in the name of Jesus. We can do the things that you were doing. And they grew because of that, and they found joy because of that. It's if we just stick people in the classroom and teach them forever, they'll just get stuck at stage 2. I think there's a challenge there for our children and young people. Do we just leave our children and young people to learn in a classroom until they're 18? No. What does it look like for us to release them, to discover their gifts at a young age and to use them, to learn to pray for each other, to pray for us, to learn to serve at that age? That's what's going to help them grow more than anything. So this is stage 3, the productive life. What's the goal? Well, actually, it's to strive for success and fruit. And I just want you to watch this in my ministry, because this is some of the danger of stage 3. We begin to think it's all about us. We think we've got all the answers. We think it's all about our ministry, what we do for God. And some of the dangers there are actually it's easy to burn out, as I have done, as others in this room have done. And actually perhaps just become weary of serving and doing good, because all the energy we put into doing the stuff. And there's also a danger, I think, that we play God. And we seek to do his work for him rather than with him. And I think that's different. We think we've got to fix everything. But God says, no, I fix stuff, and I invite you to play your part in that. So I think this stage, actually can be a stage where we can be quite arrogant in our faith. I've got all the answers. I'm doing all this amazing ministry, and God's blessing it, and it's a great time. But we just need to be a bit careful. But what is the church's role at this stage? Actually is to identify the gifts of people. How do we help people move on from stage 2 to stage 3? It's like, let's work out, sit down with you. What's God gifted you as? What are you passionate about? And let's equip and release them and encourage them and give them opportunities to serve so that they can come back and say, wow, look what God did through me. And that will grow people's faith. So that's the first 3. Just take a moment before we go on to 4, 5, and 6 to just, if you want to, just share any thoughts with the person next to you about what struck you. If you want to just think on your own, just say, I want to just process this on my own. But 1 minute to just share with each other what's struck you from those first 3 stages. What might God have been highlighted to you? Okay, I'm going to stop you there because we just want to move on. So I think that's generally what I think the church does really well, stages 1, 2, and 3. And I hope that most of us, recognise those stages. And, I suspect most of us in this room are at stage 3 or above. But then let's look what happens next. So let's turn to Matthew 16, 21 to 25. Because this, I think, is where, for some, we might be going into new territory. And some people in this room may not have reached, these stages. Some may never do. I think some people just sail through life and actually don't hit the crisis of stage 4 or 5. But Matthew 16, let's have a look at Matthew 16, verses 21 to 25. Jesus suddenly starts predicting his death. And it ain't what Peter wants to hear. It's not what I thought this was all about, is basically going on in his head. Let's hear it. Verse 21, page 983. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. And Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Peter's saying, it's not what we signed up for, Jesus. This isn't my image, who I've got of the Messiah. Doesn't make sense anymore. That's what happens often in stage 4. Because in stage 4, we hit that place where actually sometimes our confidence that we had in stage 3, have I got all the answers, just disappears. What can happen is that it might be triggered by a life crisis, a health issue, a job loss, a relationship breakdown, a midlife crisis, a transition, e.g., the transition to retirement can often trigger this. And it might be a faith crisis. Suddenly we see the old faith that we've been brought up in, which is so black and white, doesn't work anymore. We question things, we begin to doubt, we have disappointments where prayers haven't been answered, where we've been hurt by the church, hurt by leaders, where we've seen unanswered prayer. And we find ourselves in that place of thinking, I don't know where I am anymore. I reached this for the first time when I was about 30. I can remember a distinct moment. I'd been busy in stage 3 doing for God. I'd been involved at Christian Union at university. I'd moved to a church in Warwick, and I was leading services and doing a whole load of stuff for God. And then I got to a place at 29 where I said, I don't know whether this is true or not. I don't know whether this is actually what I've just made up and been told in my head. I could argue everything away if I really wanted to. Every prayer I could argue away. Every answer to prayer I reckoned I could argue away. And I pulled back from leading services for a while, because that's what you do often at stage 4, is you pull back to just give you space to process. And the thing that really helped me most was that there was a guy called John Ayrton, who, the Harveys here tonight? No. Oh yes, they are. Graham knows. Who was here, actually visited church about 6 months ago. He was an elder at the church, and he just took me to the pub. And he just sat with me, and he just journeyed with me as I shared my stuff. And he didn't judge me for backsliding. He just was there for me. And a short answer to what happened is that a few months later I decided to go to on a tear fund team that summer. And I said to God, I'm not going on any evangelistic tear fund teams. I'm going to go on a building team, because I'm not sure I believe in this stuff enough to go and do any evangelism. And I went on that building team that summer. And I've told the story before. There in a remote village with no electricity, no running water, behind a house, I met every morning and I prayed. And I heard God's voice, and I heard God speak to me for the first time. And I learned that actually prayer is a two-way thing. And I saw things on that trip which I couldn't argue away anymore. And I came back from that trip knowing that God was real. And whilst we were there, we were the most evangelistic team out of all the tier 1 teams that went that summer. And God really blessed, what was going on in our team. But I had to sit and go through that, and other people had to sit with me. And I think, that's what happens in this place. Often we rediscover God in this place. Actually we change where before it was black and white, we just allow actually the questions to come, the doubts to come and process them, but not on our own, with somebody. And I think the role of the church in this place, it's so easy in this place to say, they're backsliding, they've stopped doing that stuff, they're not coming to church anymore, when actually people are stuck in stage 4. And what church needs to do is just walk alongside them and love them and do what John Eyre did with me and just journey with me through that. One of the things that was a phrase that at New Wine Conference this week that was said was I don't know who it was, someone said this, said, God never wastes a crisis. Sometimes actually it's in the crisis that the most significant transformation happens. And when we have those crises, and those of us who've been through crisis know, and God brought us through, know what difference it makes. I can see a few people nodding. And actually, what would it be like when we have a crisis next time, actually to say, God, this is an opportunity. I don't understand what's happening, but I want you to use this to transform me. And maybe actually we'll see things differently. And then let's move on, because in part, somewhere on stage 4, you can hit the wall. Some people might bounce to stage 4 and then bounce back to stage 3, but others, will actually eventually somewhere hit the wall. Let's have a look at Matthew 26. This, I think, was Peter's wall. Peter denying Jesus, Matthew 26, 69 to 75. Page 998. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You were with Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all, etc., etc., etc. Denies him 3 times. Go down to verse 74. Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately a cock crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and he wept bitterly. Peter hit the wall. We talk about hitting the wall in a marathon race, don't we? If you've ever run a marathon, at some point later on in the race, people hit the wall where their bodies just stop working. And sometimes it's like that stage with us in faith too. We hit the wall, we hit something where just it all stops. And the wall's a scary place. The wall's the stopping place between stages 4 and 5. But actually at the wall, it can be the start of real healing. Because the wall is the place where we have to, as Helen was saying earlier, we have to let go completely. We have to say, I can't do it anymore. I can't fix this. God has to. It's a place where we have to relinquish our egos, our wounds, and all else that stands between us and God. Have that phrase, the dark night of the soul. That's the wall. But it's the place, if we journey through, we heal spiritually and emotionally in a remarkable way. And I've known some of that. And God's still doing some of that in me. But it's an uncomfortable place where actually we can no longer ignore our baggage and our history and the wounds. And we allow God to deal with them. The lady who's written this says this about the wall, said the stories of most of those we revere, the founders of our faith, the saints, the missionaries, and most of the great biblical figures all indicates a major crisis point at which everything for them was on the line. I.e., all the great saints of the past have hit the wall. And only by moving into and through these experiences were these matriarchs and patriarchs able to fulfill their mission, God's mission in their lives. If we want to really know God, we have to journey through the wall. Not over it, not under it, but through it. Think of some of the other examples of in the Bible. Elijah in the cave. I want to die, God. Jacob wrestling with God. And that's what it is. A lot of this is a wrestle with God. Story of Job is one big story of Job going through the wall. Jonah in the belly of the fish, perhaps. Each of these people was taken to a point of powerlessness where I can't fix it. And they have to let go of everything and offer it to God. And the wall can be a long process. Actually it's about taking out one stone at a time. The wall can last for years. I'll share about my wall in a moment. And the key thing is, this is the key thing more than anything, we can't go through the wall alone. I can't stress that enough. We can't do this on our own. And that doesn't just mean we need God to do it with us. We need others to do it with us. We need spiritual directors. For me, it's been psychotherapists and counselors as well as spiritual directors. It's about going on retreats. It's about taking time out and having people journey with us, praying stuff through with us. Because we can't get through the wall on our own. If we do, we will never make it. So what's the church's role in the wall? Well, actually, our role is to find the resources for people, spiritual directors, counselors, psychotherapists, prayer ministers. Christian Prayer Ministries is an amazing example of helping people go through the wall and dealing with baggage. And actually, the church is there to love people as they journey through, because it's hard. And it's painful. And you don't want to do it. But it's worth it. What happens when we hit the wall? I think we can have different responses. I think the first one can be paralysis. We can just get stuck. And we can endlessly search, particularly intellectually, and go round and round and round in circles and just end up getting stuck at the wall for years and years and years because we're trying to do it on our own. Something else I think we can do is we can just bounce off the wall and we can actually give up. We can give up on faith altogether, or we can just go and find a different flavour without dealing with our stuff. But what John Mark Comer says in his stuff, if we just go and find a different flavour, a different denomination, whatever, then we'll just go back to stage one in that, but eventually we'll come back and hit the wall again. John 6:66, if you have a look at it, has this, talks about Jesus doing some hard teachings about his suffering. And then there's this verse, John 6:66. Hadn't realised it was all the sixes. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. It's one of the most painful verses in the whole of the Bible. These people who journeyed with Jesus had hit the wall and they turned back and they give up on Jesus because they don't want to journey through and have the pain of journeying through. I think another thing we can do is just retreat and avoid. And what we do is we retreat back to where it's comfortable and where we're in control in stage 3. And we can retreat to busyness and doing and leading, because actually that's an excuse not to deal with our stuff. I think it's so common. So common. Or what we can do is to have the courage to journey through the wall with others and find new life and freedom, and actually maybe a new picture of God and a new flavour of faith. I'm going to be talking more about the wall in part 2 of this on the 17th of March, because there's so much more I could say about that. 17th of March, Monday the 17th of March, after our Lent's gathering at 7, I'm going to talk about this, do an hour on this at 8 o'clock that day. Come back for part 2 if that particularly helps you. But let's look at Peter, because the story didn't end there for Peter. Let's go to John 21. John 21, 15 to 17, because Jesus takes him, doesn't he, around that campfire, around that fire that morning, cooking fish, back on the beach where they catch another load of fish. And Jesus reinstates Peter, doesn't he? Verse 15 and 17. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he says, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. And Peter was taken through the wall and given healing and shown forgiveness and given 3 times to acknowledge that he loved Jesus for the 3 times he denied Jesus. And Peter left that fire. He could have turned back. He could have given up. But he left that fire a different man. And then in Acts 2, the Holy Spirit comes and does that deep work of God that only God can do in us, and brought him courage and even more fire and faith. That was Peter moving into stage 5, which is called the outwards journey. And faith stage 5 is all about surrendering to God. No longer do we try and control God. No longer do we minister for God. We just say, God, here I am. I lay everything down. It's exactly what Helen Wilkinson was saying this morning. I lay it all down. And the goal of that is intimacy with God and a deep healing of everything. And what we find when we journey through is, I think this is the big word here, acceptance. Acceptance of who we are. Acceptance of who others are. Acceptance of our wounds and our disappointments and the stuff which hasn't worked out in our lives that we all carry once we get to a certain age. And rather than fighting against them and being bitter about them, we just say, that happens. And God's journeyed with me through it. And he shaped me through it. And I accept that. I accept who I am. I accept I'm not who I want to be. I accept my spouse isn't who I want them to be. And I stop trying to make them be somebody else. And we come to that acceptance, self-acceptance. What I meant to say in stage 4 is that the danger in stage 4 is that actually if we hit that midlife crisis, we can so easily blame that on other things, and particularly our marriages. That's when people can give up on their marriages, because actually of what's happening, they just blame the spouse and its disappointment of that marriage, and that's when so many divorces and separations can happen. Instead of dealing with our own stuff and letting God do the healing, we can blame other people and point the finger at other people. At stage 5 is a stage where actually we're learning to trust God completely, learning, as Helen said this morning, to let go and let God. And actually we begin to be able to pray the prayer, bring me closer to you no matter what the consequences. I'm thinking of the old Methodist covenant prayer that we so easily say, that's so blooming difficult to say. Look at those words. Put me to doing, put me to suffering, let me be employed for you, or laid aside for you. Those of us who actually have just still got issues with our status and our own egos, that's so hard, being laid aside. Exalted for you or brought low to you, let me be full, let me be empty, let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and wholeheartedly yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. That's what stage 5 is all about, giving everything up for God and saying, I hand it over to you. I'm not going to try and fix it anymore. And what we find, I think, in stage 5 is we begin to see, have a greater gratitude and appreciation of the small things. We often become the people who can begin to mentor and accompany others who are actually struggling to go through those earlier stages themselves. And I think the church's role here is to release, people into mentoring, being, offering wise counsel to others. And then stay in John 21. Look at the next 2 verses, John 21, 18 and 19. Until this week, I'd never really focused on these and grasped these until I listened to a brilliant podcast by John Mark Comer this week, and I'm quoting him. I give God all the glory through him. John 21, 18, page 1090. So this is after Jesus has reinstated Peter. Then he says, Very truly, Jesus, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the type of death by which Peter would glorify God. But I think it's more than that. I think what we see here is just Jesus talking about the different halves of life. Richard Rohr talks about 2 halves of life. A lot of people talk about active and passive discipleship. Look at it. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. You were in control. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and say, I let go of everything. And someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. I think that's some of the indication of that journey, is that actually, Jesus takes us on to those levels of saying, actually, where we're aiming for is to say, God, you're in control. It's not me at the center of this. It's God at the center of this. And I surrender everything to you. We don't have to force it, but we let God do the deep work in us. And that's where we move on to stage 6, the life of love, which, very few get to, and I probably never will. Well, actually, it becomes reflecting God. A few things here. Our work in our ministry at this stage is love. Our ministry of love heals people, and healed people heal others. We're healed, and we help others to heal. It talks about there, I won't read it all out, but it talks about, we're prepared to give up everything in order to know Jesus better and follow him. That's the ultimate goal, to be like Jesus. A little tiny bit about my journey to finish off. It's a picture I painted on my retreat, and I want Bonnie to paint me a better one. So excuse my art. But on retreat in January, I didn't know what I was going to do in those 4 days. I came to God with empty hands and no agenda. And this is where God took me. And he took me to some of these podcasts to work through this stuff. And I felt what God was saying to me on retreat was, he said, Dave, you're just emerging from the wall after 9 years. Just felt him saying to me that actually throughout my time here in Malvern, I've been journeying through the wall, battling stuff, with my mental health, with other stuff. But actually what God was saying is you're coming out, you're emerging from the wall. And it really resonated with me. And it reminded me, I go back to 2017 in Chapel House in Worcester, one of the first retreats I ever did from this church on my own. I was not in a great place, and I went and picked up a book from the bookshelf. And in that bookshelf, I turned to chapter 3 for some reason. On that first page, it says, some people see God as a demanding taskmaster. And I said, that's me. I said, that's how I see God. And it had come from a lot of it had come from my early years. Our stories, our backstories hugely affect how we are. My backstory is that when I was a week old, as a baby, I swelled up and went all yellow. And I was rushed into Great Ormond Street. And I was there for 6 of my first 7 weeks of my life. And they found I had a hole in my heart, which I still have. But I was very, very ill as a baby. People were praying for me. And subconsciously along the line, I told the story to myself that I was saved for a reason. And therefore I had to achieve. And I had to make up for the fact that God had saved me. And that had turned me into, along with my Protestant work ethic upbringing and some influences from my Cypher camp and other sources, had turned me into doing for God and finding my value in what I did for God. It says there, on the left-hand side, useful equals valuable. That's what I believed. And so my God was a driven taskmaster who I just had to please and work for God on my own. And that's the wall, part of the wall that God's been breaking me through over these last 9 years. That's the left-hand side. Striving, Useful equals valuable. But actually the picture that God gave me quite soon afterwards when I went to St. Bino's on a treat was that picture I shared before with you of the icon of Christ and the unknown disciple. Of Jesus putting his arm around me and walking with me and saying, let's do it together. And you can just see, in the distance, there's Jesus and me, up right at the top, near the horizon. And my new picture of God is that God as a friend who walks with me. That's the journey of my walk. Gone from God as the demanding taskmaster to God as a friend who walks with me and alongside me. And then we do life together. And I've learnt to rest a bit more. I've learned to find joy. And I've found freedom and a lightness which I've not had before. And I'm still on that journey. And there's still bits of me that are actually the other side of the wall breaking through. When I prepared this talk, I thought there's a particular area of my life which I'm right up against the wall, but even in the last week, God has begun to break through and take 1 brick, 2 bricks, 3 bricks out of that bit of wall in my life. I'm going to share more of my story on the 17th of March and explain a bit more, but that's just to give you a glimpse. And that's why I want to share it with you, because God's got so much more for each one of us, if only we have the courage to journey through. I encourage you to listen to some John Mark Comer podcasts. I'll put these on the mailing this week. They're brilliant on this, and he tells it much better than I do. But I want to just give us some time. And there's when I'm doing Encountering the Wall, 17th of March, 8 o'clock. Encountering the Wall, part 2. But I want to finish giving us space, and we've got a good amount of time. And I want to hand out these. So you've got it in front of you. Can you grab one and just take one? And I want you just to spend a few minutes just reflecting on your own, and here's some questions to ask. What do you think is your home stage at the moment? And I think one of the things, I did this with the staff team a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things I think is really helpful is that it gives you a language to say, that's where I am. We had staff, some of the staff coming up to me and saying, I'm at the wall. I'm in stage 4. I don't know what I believe anymore. What do you think your home stage is at the moment? Where have you come from? Think back over your life, celebrate it. We're just going to do a little bit of this now, but I encourage you to go and take a couple of hours in the next couple of weeks and work through these questions. Wherever you come from, celebrate it. Are you stuck? Are you moving? Are you in transition? Are you retreating? Are you just in a good place in one of these stages, wherever that might be? Then what might God be asking you to do to move on in your journey? What might be the next step for you to move on in your journey? And how can the church help? How can I help? How can we help? How can we help each other? So I just want to give you 6 or so minutes now just to begin that reflection. And I want to pray. Lord, I want to pray right now that you would give us revelation and insights to see where we are, to see where you're calling us. I want to pray that you'll give us the courage to admit where we are, the courage to break through the wall if we're at the wall, the courage to go into uncomfortable places, knowing that you will want to bring us freedom and a lightness and a new image of you. So as we reflect in this silence, would you speak? Would you just help us to lay aside anything that's not helpful and not relevant to us, and just highlight to us what you want to highlight to us today? By the power of the Holy Spirit, in the name of Jesus. Amen. Let's just sit in this place for a few minutes. couple of things to say. One is, just look at Jesus' example as Peter journeyed through his life. Jesus never condemned. He never made him feel bad. Jesus was just there at every moment to just encourage him through and be with him. That's what we want to be as a church. That's what Jesus wants to do with you. You know, we don't need to be ashamed to say, this is where I am, I'm against the wall, I'm stuck. This is where I am, I'm doubting. This is where I am, it's not making sense anymore. But sometimes we just have the courage need to have the courage to voice that to others before they can help us journey through. And I want us to be a church which does stages 4 and 5 well. I'm not sure I can offer to do stage 6 well for you guys, but I want us to be a church which does 4 and 5 and through the wall well. Where we're not afraid to say that's where I am. And we journey with each other to move forward. Just want to give a time, to again respond differently now. We've got people who would love to pray. It might be that actually you want to just say to the person next to you that actually this is what resonated with me. Will you pray? That's where I am. This is what I need. I think sharing where we are, getting it out into the light is such a key part of us moving on. Just having the courage to say this is where I am. And for those of us who are in a good place, just celebrate. Celebrate where God's taken us. And actually, you might just you want to go to someone and say, will you pray for me? Because I just want to rejoice today that this is where God's taken me. Let's do that. For those of us who actually are here in a tougher place, just find others who can walk this journey with you. Don't be afraid. Because God's got so much more and He wants you to walk freely and lightly.